Um, thanks to the folks who are participating. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Hana Nabulsi. Thanks, Hana.
Thank you, Dean Hessler. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this year's first Teachers in Animal Law webinar. We're really excited to be kicking off this webinar series again with such an important and interesting topic, not to mention such a great panel. But before we get started with today's discussion, I do want to just give a brief introduction to myself for those of you who may not know me. I'm Hana Nabulsi. I am a 3L at George Washington University Law School, and I will be the moderator for today's event. And before we get into the panelist introductions, I would like to just give a brief overview of this webinar series for those of you who may not be familiar with it. The Animal Law program at GW Law has established the Animal Legal Education Initiative, which strives to incorporate animal law as a standalone discipline within the legal academy. And this webinar series is really intended to support those efforts by creating opportunities for adjunct professors across the country to connect and to collaborate with one another. But we also hope to provide, academic resources and a support system that can help you accomplish your goals within your institution. So these webinars are truly intended to be a conversational place where we can all talk and network. So to that end, please do feel free to send any questions or comments in the chat. Unmute yourself at any point if you have a question, but I also will reserve a few minutes at the end if anyone would like to save their questions towards the end. We'll have that option as well. Because this is a conversational place where we hope to network, we also do encourage you to turn on your videos if you're able and comfortable doing so. It's always great to be able to put faces to names, but no pressure to. And then I finally want to mention that if you missed our webinar series last year in the spring, the recordings of those 3 webinars are now up on the GW Law website, so please feel free to check those out. And this event today is also being recorded and will also be made available on the website. So if you'd like to reference back to our conversation or share this with some of your friends, please feel free to do that. One final thing I'll mention before we get started today. We have our next 2 webinars already scheduled for this semester. So our next one will be discussing online teaching on October 23rd. And our third one this semester will be addressing current issues and politics inside and outside the law school. That will be on November 20th, and both of those webinars will be at 6 p.m. Eastern. Moving on to today's webinar, we will be discussing non-traditional teaching tools, and we have a wonderful panel today. So I'd like to turn it over to them to give brief introductions, and we can go ahead and start with Professor Henry.
Hi, yeah. So I'm Ralph Henry. I teach at Georgetown University Law Center and taught up till this year at George Mason Law School for 15 years. I've taught at Georgetown since 2017. And outside of teaching, my primary vocation is as the Director of Litigation for the Humane Society of the United States.
Thank you so much. Professor Winders?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. It's great to see some new names and old names. I am an associate professor of law and the director of the Animal Law and Policy Institute at Vermont Law and Graduate School. I also started teaching animal law about 15 years ago, and I started as an adjunct. I've adjuncted at a number of schools. I've taught animal law at, I think, 6 law schools now, and I've had the privilege to teach some more specific animal law classes in addition to the overview class and to incorporate some non-traditional methods. So I'm really excited about this conversation.
Yes, thank you. Me too. I think both of you have some great experience to talk about this, and I think it's such an important topic. So without further ado, I think maybe we can start our conversation today by just addressing the overarching question of what is non-traditional teaching? What are non-traditional teaching tools?
Well, maybe Delcy will have a better answer than I will, so I'll start by saying that I don't know that there's a perfect answer here. I think traditional, in the context of animal law particularly, often is associated with sort of a survey of existing laws governing our interactions with animals, often in kind of a seminar setting. It tends to be the traditional law school course, right, is very doctrinally focused. And so I think we could fairly say that non-traditional is anything else. And so that could include differences in course structure from a sort of typical survey or seminar course, practical oriented teaching or clinics, but differences in subject matter as well that go beyond kind of discussion of what sort of the existing legal framework is as applied to animals.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think I guess we'll take as the baseline animal law survey class using the Socratic method as the traditional approach. It's hard to say if there is actually a traditional animal law class, since it is a relatively new field and there are a lot of people teaching and taking different approaches. But we are encouraged to use the Socratic method because somebody 150 years ago thought that was a good idea. So I would say anything that goes beyond that. So I would include things that get more subject matter specific. So some of the courses I've taught include animal welfare law. I'm currently teaching science of animal law and policy. So being able to drill down with a bit more specificity. Related to that, interdisciplinary classes. So science of animal law and policy, I'm teaching with Dr. Lori Marino, who's a neuroscientist. And so we're really taking an interdisciplinary approach. Animal welfare law is a course that I developed with a veterinarian, Dr. Heather Rowley, and we taught together. I think intensive courses also fall into this category. So at Vermont Law and Graduate School, we have a pretty robust summer program, which has classes that run from as short as 1 weekend to 3 weeks long. We have animal law classes throughout that time period. So we've got a 4-day undercover investigations class, and then classes every term. So I think that would fall into the category, and it opens it up for practitioners to come in and teach and share their knowledge when they wouldn't necessarily be able to do so on a regular basis. And for people who can't take the time to be in school full time to do that. I know there's a separate webinar coming up on online teaching, but I think online is becoming more traditional, but it's non-traditional. And then there's synchronous and asynchronous. I think incorporating non-law students into your classes. So we have animal protection public policy degrees. So I've got public policy students in my class, and they really help offer a broader perspective. Like Ralph said, clinics, practicums, field studies. So we've got a field study program where students will go for typically a week out into the field. So we've got some public lands management ones, which obviously touch on wildlife issues. And so students are out on public land in Montana. We've also got one that's gone to Bears Ears in Utah. We send students to the UN Climate Change Conference. So none of these are animal specific. We're working on developing one where students would be working with the Aegean Marine Life Sanctuary out of Greece with marine mammals. But I think that's a very non-traditional but really powerful teaching approach. I promise I'm getting to the end. Interactive activities in class, like going beyond the Socratic message. So anything from group work to simulation. Kristen Stilt at Harvard Law School developed class activity centered around the draft convention on animal protection for public health, animal welfare, and the environment. And she assigns students different interests to represent their embassies. Some are representing trade groups, some are advocacy groups. So I'm planning to incorporate that later this semester, and I'm excited about it. This book that I recently read, Teaching Law by Design, I don't know if you can see it. No, it's blurry. It's called Teaching Law by Design. Matthew Liebman at USF Law recommended it, highly recommend it. And they suggest that you do 3 different activities in each class to keep students engaged. And unfortunately, that is non-traditional. Field trips. So I've done zoo visits with students with very specific Animal Welfare Act assignments. independent research projects where you work one-on-one with students, and then that opens up what you can work on. So I've done some very practical projects with students, some of them with coalitions from nonprofits, practical assignments. So I've assignments like FOIA requests, op-eds. I do media training with students in some of my classes. So that's some of the stuff I'll throw out. And if people are interested in particular avenues, I'm happy to chat more about it.
Well, thank you so much for that broad overview. It's great to know that there's lots of different non-traditional teaching tools and how engaging they can be. And you mentioned the book that people can look into if they'd like to read more about it. But just out of curiosity, are there any other resources that you've been able to tap into? For example, does the ABA say anything about non-traditional teaching?
You know, I don't know that the ABA has a lot of, it doesn't define non-traditional teaching, at least in terms of its standards for law schools. I see Professor Hessler nodding, so that gives me a little bit of confidence in that answer. I will say that the ABA rules, at least around teaching, do talk about the fact that now law schools are required to provide a variety of different types of teaching to students, including now it's an obligation to provide practical experience to students. It's an obligation to provide cross-cultural education. I think non-traditional tools can get to some of these. For instance, ABA Rule 303 talks about how we're required as teachers to help students develop a professional identity, and as also being a hiring manager. You know, when we look at new law grads coming into our practice or early laterals, I often hope that those applicants think about what they might get out of work with us. And I expect other hiring managers do as well. And so I think it's our obligation as teachers to think about sort of helping students understand what it's like to be a particular type of lawyer, to address a particular area of law, and to develop sort of their professional identity, you know. And so I think that the ABA speaks to that a bit as well. And then they do have, I mean, the ABA does have some information about other areas of study beyond sort of the most typical areas of study, and so talks about things like self-directed education, which Delcy had a very long list of things that she does that are non-traditional, and she's been at this a lot longer than I have. But I will say that I've also served as advisors to students who have had sort of separate independent study efforts. And in an area like animal law, where everything's sort of changing so fast and there's so much opportunity for students to sort of look to the future of what the discipline of animal law will be, that having student-directed education, whether it's independent study or as part of your course, having students sort of dive into an issue, present it, somewhat direct their own education, I think is maybe something that is consistent with where the ABA recommendations are. But I'm not as an adjunct, I'm definitely not an expert in sort of like what the ABA requires. You know, we tend to not get too much support from law schools and not too much directives, which is why I'm very, very pleased that we have this group anyway.
Yeah, I agree with everything Ralph just said, including the last thing. When I was an adjunct, I got my contract and then had no interaction with anybody at the institution. So I think it's amazing that this webinar series exists and the community that it's creating. Yeah, I think the ABA standards actually create a lot of potential hooks to incorporate animal law, like Ralph said. And then beyond that, they give a lot of flexibility, and I think in some ways increasing flexibility. So you can have some of your study abroad, you can have some of your study online, you can have some of your study outside of the classroom. Obviously, there are credit limits for most all of those things, but they do afford a fair amount of flexibility. And I think in addition to the book and this group, I think just reaching out to people who have taught this topic and asking what they've done, what's worked for them, and for them to share resources. People are very generous with their materials. I'm happy to chat with people if they're exploring different potential approaches to teaching. Kristen still, like I said, shared all of her materials for this exercise that I'm going to do. People are pretty generous with their stuff, so take advantage of it. They want more animal law classes.
Yeah, and thank you both for mentioning this group because, like I said in the intro, this really is meant to be a place where we can network and collaborate and share ideas. So I hope that this can be the next big resource for all things animal law. So you both have extensive experience teaching and have mentioned some of the non-traditional tools that you have employed in the past. But I'm wondering what of those tools that you have used proved to be especially successful to your students, or what would you recommend to professors that would like to have more engaging teaching tools?
You want me to start, Ralph? I think a lot of things. I won't say the whole list again. I think the practically oriented assignments are really good. So many times I've had former students say to me, you know, I had to do this thing at whether it's their internship or their job post-graduation, and I knew how to do it because you had us do it. So it could be a Freedom of Information Act request. I had a meeting earlier today with a recent grad who I actually put in touch with a reporter, and we had done media training together. And so she felt totally prepared for it. She had amazing sound bites. So I think those things are great because they're really practically oriented, and they help train people to be animal advocates if that's something that they're aspiring to do, and to be good ones. I think the interdisciplinary approaches I think are really valuable because we tend to get very narrow-minded in law. And you can see that happening early on with law students. And so being able to bring in other disciplines and other perspectives is really valuable. I mean, even if you just look at legal scholarship, we tend to not pay attention to what's happening in the rest of the universe. So I think that's really valuable. Clinic, obviously, hugely valuable. I can't tell you the number of times students have said, like, that's when everything fell into place. That's when I understood what I learned 1L year and like why it matters and what it means. So those are some of them, but I think there are a lot.
Yeah, you know, I love the answer about exercises. Sometimes I get groans from students when they see in syllabus that there's going to be an obligation for, say, a student presentation, and then invariably the responses and student feedback at the end of the semester are that we loved that and we loved hearing from our, you know, our cohort and not just the professor. I love the answer of interdisciplinary approach. I hadn't thought of it, but also hearing from, I think this is part of it, hearing from non-lawyers or the perspective of non-lawyers. I feel like as law students, most folks don't hear a lot about the motivations of non-lawyers in the various sort of conflicts and situations we find ourselves in as practitioners, whether you're working on policy or litigation or whatever. And so bringing in either guest speakers, or one thing I like to do that's gotten a lot of rave reviews, but I think mostly because it's just different than what students have to do for other classes, is mix up the types of materials that are provided for prep materials. And animal law, especially if we're talking about animal law as sort of a law policy reform effort, the animal law that kind of goes on by advocates in this arena, really lends itself to considering the motivations of a variety of different people and different inputs. So it could be news articles, or I'll assign briefs, or even oral arguments, which are a little tricky because, you know, most cases have sort of procedural and factual history reported, and that's kind of useful. But you can tee up some of that information for the students, and then asking students about, you know, why it is that, you know, an advocate did a certain thing, or a judge asked a certain question, or why talking points look the way they do, and then translating that to the exercises that Delcy talked about. I think that's really helpful for students to kind of engage animal law in a way that students don't get to engage other sort of legal doctrines, or sorry, legal subjects in other classes.
Yeah, and as a student, I can say that that is correct. All of those things are very helpful, especially the practical experience exercises and bringing in other areas of law. I think those two especially really help prepare us for practice, and I've seen it in my internships. So thank you for everyone that is working to implement those. My next question is if you've noticed if there's any specific class types. So we mentioned online teaching, so maybe online versus in person, or student types that lend themselves better to non-traditional teaching tools.
Well, I'll just start by saying your comment about student types is really is something that that creates an idea in my mind around the fact that in my upper level seminars, not every student learns the same way. And I think it's really important to recognize. And so using a variety of teaching tools is really helpful. I see students engage sort of exercises different from readings, or I teach a practicum course. And so I have some students that are much more excited to talk about what they're engaging in when they're working with a supervising attorney than when they're sort of responding to reading that is, to set up discussion in class. And so I think thinking about different student types is a really good way into considering what types of non-traditional teaching tools you might use. And then, I'm a practitioner, I'm a litigator, so I have a bias toward storytelling and practical oriented education. And so I do think that regardless of what class type your class is structured as, it might be listed as a seminar, even if you're teaching a clinic, you can still manage to fit some of these different tools into sort of any class structure and really provide the students, more holistic education.
Yeah, yet again, agree with all of that. I think you can incorporate non-traditional teaching approaches in any kind of class. Exactly how you do it is going to be different. Obviously, if you're teaching an online class and you've got people all over the country or even the world, maybe they're going out and visiting different kinds of sites, and then there can be a really interesting conversation about that. Whereas if you're in person, you can all go somewhere together, and they all have value. As far as different student types, I think law students are more resistant to non-traditional, but they benefit from it and they're gonna do it if that's what you're doing in class. And so I'd say just do it and they will learn from it. And ultimately, like Ralph said about the presentations, probably some of the time actually enjoy it. And I think just having a mix of different activities really, really supports their education. And so I think no matter what kind of teaching setting you're in, if you can incorporate that, it's beautiful.
I do think that when I get students seeming a little fearful of the idea of, say, student presentations or something that seems non-traditional, that it's probably a result of it just not being what's expected from a typical law school course. And so I do think that it's helpful to explain to students what the purpose is of sort of something that looks non-traditional in the syllabus and then at the beginning of a course when you start to go into it. I think if you explain like this is why we're gonna do this. I actually had a session of my practicum course about an hour and a half ago, and we went long through a portion of the session that's dedicated to students presenting on projects associated with their placements. And I let it go long, but I explained to them why I let it go long and what I hoped I thought they would get out of it. And I hope that saves me from like a negative comment that we didn't address enough of the reading or something like that. Because it seemed like the discussion was really good and it seemed like students were really engaged. And so I just tried to be really transparent in the moment about where we were going. And I think transparency, whether it's in the moment that something happens or in the contract between you and the students that is the syllabus and the beginning of class, is really helpful and takes away some of maybe the trepidation associated with something seeming non-traditional.
Thank you. Well, I see we have a question from Fran, so please feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Thanks. I actually had 3 questions now. So with the projects that you're doing in class, are you doing it in the survey course or in a more of an elective that's more refined, like a livestock class or something like that? And second question, if you're doing the survey course, is it a 2-hour or a 3-hour? And then if you want the third question, is just, Ralph, if you could explain more about those projects in class, because I did one of my natural resources and it was not as successful because everybody was just going to Wikipedia and pulling everything off, and it was very sad.
That's interesting. Well, I haven't taken the last one first. I haven't had that problem, although I tend to group students when I do exercises with each other and kind of make them work together. I think that helps prevent them from
Maybe I'll do that.
staying in their, in their computer, face down or something like that. Just so they have to talk it out. I try to make the exercises short and very basic so that students can, it's amazing where students will take something. They will take something far afield from where you thought they would be, no matter how much you structure it. And so I try to keep exercises pretty simple. I do those as well as student presentations. My class right now is a practicum, so those are focused on their placements, but I've guest taught at other classes where there are student presentations. David Wolfson always did student presentations in his courses at NYU, and those were really open-ended. Student dive into this particular issue and tell us what you learn. And as someone who practices in the area, it's always boring, right? It's always the students are reporting to you stuff that you've already heard 1,000 times maybe, but it's really cool for them. So I do it in survey courses, even if the exercises then, mean that they can come from just about anywhere, and we're only going to scratch the surface a little bit of a particular area of the law, because for a lot of students that take animal law take it out of curiosity. Let's face it, they're not all going to be animal law practitioners. As a animal law practitioner, I don't want them all to be animal law practitioners. So I think it's totally cool to do sort of exercises or student driven learning in survey courses as well. Also, not part of the 3 questions, but when I came to speak at Fran's school 17,000 years ago, she gave me this cute statue of a bear, and I still have it in my office, Fran. So just thank you for that little.
So yeah, I also do in-class projects in both the survey class and more, specific classes, more tailored classes. In the survey class, it's not necessarily going to be every single class session. My class is 3 credits rather than 2, so that gives us a bit more flexibility. But I try to strike a balance between activities, group work, and talking at them and having discussion with them.
Well, thank you. And thank you for those questions. I wanted to come back. You mentioned using multiple tools at once in your courses. So my question is, how do you assess students when you're using non-traditional teaching tools, especially when you're using different tools in one course?
I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. In terms of actual sort of grading, no matter how I structure my course, I've always done a final exam or final paper and courses. So in terms of like what the students are getting as a reward for the class, as an assessment for the class, that never changes. In terms of assessment of their activities, which I think the question is targeted to specifically to the non-traditional tools, I think we always leave room for discussion around what's happening afterward. And so, for instance, just to use an example, in today's class, one of our students presented on her project, and my co-professor who was there, I was lead, we do this kind of lead peanut gallery, he's peanut gallery today. He commented how her sort of synthesis and description of the project was so good for an audience of people who didn't really know the project, and went through a ton of details and then explained how that would be good for a particular audience that we might be talking to, that's not getting into the weeds. And so I think I just say that because I think having kind of follow-up discussion in front of the whole of the student class about what various successes are is part of learning. And so I don't have any particular way of assessing it other than sort of explaining what I thought a student should get out of it, whether it seems like the student got it out of it, and then furthering teaching from it. But in none of my classes do we do kind of like periodic, like grade dependent assessments prior to final examination. Maybe I should.
I am not a big fan of grades. I went to UC Santa Cruz for undergrad, so my transcript's like this thick, but it's all narrative evaluations. I wish all of our classes could be pass fail, but we're not Yale. So for the clinics and practicum, it can be, which I think is fantastic because then students don't have to worry about that piece of it. So for some of the projects, particularly the more practically oriented ones, to the point of transparency that Ralph raised before, I try to be very clear about what things I'm going to be looking for, what I'm going to be assessing them on. So if it's a presentation, I tell them, like, I'm looking for, are you using filler words? Are you reading? Are you looking up? Are you able to respond to questions? And they have all of that in advance. And so they are graded based on what I told them and basically the rubric. For some of the more just in-class activities, group work and things like that, it's just participation credit. So they're not being assessed on the actual substance of what they do, but it counts towards their overall participation grade in the course. And sometimes I have written work that's like that too, particularly if I do surveys to check in with students about things. They have to complete it to get the participation credit, but I'm not grading the content of what they say.
Okay. Thank you. Before we move on to talking about benefits and challenges of non-traditional teaching tools, I see we have a couple of questions in the chat. First being, what do you think it is about animal law that complements non-traditional teaching so well?
That is a great question. And I think there's so many things. So I'm going to mention one that comes to mind, and that is that many of us who practice animal law or have been involved in this field talk all the time about how the fact that animal law is really kind of like no specific thing. It's unusual in the fact that it often requires application of laws that were never really dependent on or targeting benefits for animals. And so the field encourages creative problem solving inherently. No matter how you practice it, whether you're kind of creating new laws for animals, or you're advising someone who's in an animal use industry, you're an advocate trying to advance new protections in the law through the courts, whatever it is, there's this premium on creativity. And it's really, frankly, easy for us to teach that because there's been so many efforts that animal advocates and frankly, animal users have engaged in to try to advance their interests or advance the interests of animals through peculiar ways. And I think that students, when they get introduced to that aspect of animal law, it makes it a course that is automatically sort of a kind that students are maybe open to thinking about, why it is, again, that an advocate strategized, through something. Like we try to, in my practicum course, we try to teach students about legal campaigns and the fact that, in what we do, no project exists in a vacuum, which is not true of other lawyers. And so we talk through cases and legislative efforts in discussion about where will the law go next? Where will practitioners try to take it? Where do advocates try to take it next? And so I just think the nature of animal law being one where it's not a static area of law, it's not a well-defined area of law, and there's a huge premium on creativity in the practice of it, makes animal law a great subject for students to learn through non-traditional means. And I wish school administrators knew that, because I had occasion at the beginning of the semester to talk to Office of Public Interest, it's called OPIX at Georgetown, and I talked to them about how our course And the fellowship that Georgetown offers in a one-year postgraduate position in animal law is a great opportunity for students to kind of learn lawyering from a perspective that they don't often get in many other classes. And unsurprisingly, some of the responses I got were, wow, I thought that it was such a narrow niche of the law that it was something that most students wouldn't relate to. And I think what was hidden behind that was, and so I don't necessarily counsel students to take your course or apply for that fellowship. And I'm hopeful that what I did was maybe convince them or make them think twice about that, because I really think that taking an animal law course could really benefit many law students, even ones that aren't interested in public interest work.
Yeah, I think that's so true. It's like the opposite of narrow. It incorporates every other kind of law. And so I think that's part of why it lends itself really well to non-traditional teaching approaches, because in a traditional law school class, let's say like torts or contracts, you are just very narrowly focusing on that particular area of the law. Whereas in animal law, you have to issue spot things that cross-cut all of these different subject matters. And so it lets you integrate and apply the law in a way that's much more like practice than other classes are. I think it's also helpful that animals are everywhere. You can just walk outside and there are animals. So I think that poses opportunities for different learning approaches. And then also the fact that it's so rapidly evolving. There are, always things that are happening, and you can go to a court hearing, or you can go to observe an exhibition of animals and then talk about the legal issues or whatever it may be. There's just like a wealth of opportunities there.
Thank you so much. Before I move on to the next question in the chat, Professor Winters, would you mind sharing the book information again, either verbally or if you could send the information in the chat?
I will do both. It
Thank
is Teaching Law by Design, Engaging Students from the Syllabus to the Final Exam by Michael Hunter Schwartz, Sophie Sparrow, and Gerald Hess. And I will put it in the chat as well.
Thank you. So our next question actually comes from a student, and they're asking, how much control does a student have in the classroom? This student comes from a non-law background and is more used to the non-traditional and interdisciplinary teaching approach and struggles with the straightforward traditional approach. So is it possible for the student to bring a non-traditional approach to the classroom?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question. I don't know if the asker is willing to elaborate a bit more. I think maybe as I understand it, it's in a traditional class, can you bring your non-traditional way of learning? I don't know if that's accurate. I think in an ideal world, yes. I think the professor should be mindful of the fact that people learn in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of neurodiversity. But the reality is, I think it depends class to class and professor to professor. I'm not sure if that's responsive or not. But...
Yeah, I think my answer is somewhat similar, and that was my take on the question. I mentioned this before, I view my syllabus as kind of a contract between me and my students. And so, when I set up a course structure, my assumption is kind of that the learning is going to go the same way for most students, but that some students who learn differently will get more out of some aspects of the course than others. So for me, maybe I'm just a traditional guy talking in a non-traditional webinar, but I've never really given a lot of control to the students. I think though, as my courses have evolved to involve more non-traditional teaching, those are the places where students have had more control. So by example, the practicum course that I have now, I essentially divide each session into 3 parts. the middle part of it is very syllabus reading driven, doctrinal kind of standard survey stuff. It's the me talking at them portion of it. But the first part of the session is student driven presentations. And the last part of every session is a guest speaker. And I try to, but it's very hard for me, especially if you know me, you know this is true. It's very hard for me to stay quiet, but I try to leave room for the students to ask questions, even if they are off the wall, because if a student has something that's really interesting to her, it might be interesting to someone else when it comes to the guest speaker portion, and just let that go where it goes for the most part. And then I'll maybe try to tether it back a little bit to, where I wanted us to be in that session. And so I guess my best answer is I've tried to create specific opportunities for student controlled or student driven learning around the sort of more traditional stuff that's controlled by me. But I have to be very deliberate about that. Because unless your course is entirely designed as a non-traditional course, I don't know that you can really give up control to one student or one type of learner as opposed to another. That's very hard.
I think I just want to jump in and add a little bit more. I think it's unfortunate that we don't have more student control in the law school classroom, because students taking ownership of their learning is how they're going to learn the best. And I think we probably could learn from other disciplines that incorporate that more. And I think that as a student, once you're beyond your first year, that might be something you want to make as a primary factor in choosing your courses, maybe even over the subject matter. Who is the professor? What's their approach? And what methods do they use?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. I know as a student, it's always helpful to read reviews of professors to see if their teaching style matches your learning style. But okay, now I'd like to pivot towards talking about the benefits and challenges of non-traditional teaching tools. So maybe we can just start there, talking broadly what benefits and challenges exist.
Well, I'll mention one that this is just basically me stealing your thunder, Hannah, because you mentioned it before, and that's I think non-traditional teaching methods tend to be better at prepping students for real world practice. And that's true whether or not they're going to be a litigator, or they're going to, be a lobbyist or whatever it is. So much of legal work is about reading the room and problem solving, and traditional teaching methods aren't really about that. It's sort of like spoon-fed understanding of what the law is and not how to work with it, or understand it from your own perspective or someone else's perspective. And so I think non-traditional teaching tools, all of the ones that we've mentioned, whether it's exercises or even field trips or guest speaker incorporation or mixed media or whatever, that's much more what it's like to be in real practice. And I know law schools have tried to work toward incorporating more practical education, but it's been more in the sort of like take a trial practice class or whatever. And my reality, at least as a legal practitioner, is that it's storytelling, and it's, interpersonal dynamics, and it's clients as colleagues, and it's all these other, things about problem solving, using legal tools to problem solve, that I don't think are really easily delivered via traditional means. And so that's kind of what I think is a primary benefit of non-traditional teaching.
Completely agree. I think another benefit is that it just shakes things up, which gets students' attention. Like, you're doing something different and they're going to pay more attention, and that's kind of a prerequisite for learning. So I think that's a big benefit. In terms of challenges, I think resistance from students who are used to the traditional method of learning, and that's what they expect. And maybe they don't even want to have to put in the effort to be engaged during class. I think that can be challenging. I think If you, as Ralph said earlier, explain to them why you're doing it and what you want them to get out of it. I've started giving learning outcomes at the beginning of every class, but also explaining why that particular exercise as well. I think that can go a long way in helping navigate that challenge.
I'll mention one more challenge that comes to mind. It's hyper specific, and maybe it's a product more of who I am than a challenge to non-traditional teaching generally, but in the animal law context. But I do find that one thing I'm able to do in more traditional teaching is show the students perspectives outside of a sort of pro-animal protection lane. And I do find that when I allow things to be more student driven, student presentations, students talking about their work, I don't know if it's just because most of the students that take my class are sort of very much in line with a lot of animal protection advocacy, increasing animal protection, or they think that's what I want to hear, despite the fact that in the syllabus and early sessions, I try to make sure that this is clearly a space for all kinds of views, including dissenting ones. But I do find that the more that I turn over to students, the more there becomes kind of a echo chamber around what's expected to be the pro animal position in any discussion. And in fact, sometimes I even deliberately try to play tricks on the students by, assigning a case or something like that where I would disagree with the outcome, even if it's a pro animal outcome based on, what I think is a poor legal reasoning or something like that, to stoke discussion that isn't just an echo chamber. But and maybe this is not true, but as I was thinking about this subject in preparation for this webinar, I thought when it's up to me, I feel like I can help direct a conversation to prevent the room from becoming an echo chamber. And when it's up to the students, that doesn't always happen. So I came into today's conversation wondering whether non-traditional techniques present that challenge. But maybe it's not the techniques. Maybe it's me or the subject matter or something.
Thank you. And I'll pause here because I see that we do have another question.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Real quick, and thank you all for this discussion. It's been great. I was just thinking on this last point. I'm wondering if you ever encounter any resistance, whether explicit or implicit, from administration with respect to these non-traditional methods. Because when you were talking about it, Ralph, you're saying how, and it makes perfect sense, schools are usually thinking about trial ed classes or like clinics in more traditional subjects, but you're thinking about, storytelling skills, which I'm really interested in my classes as well. And the reason I'm asking this is because if animal law is already sort of kind of still marginalized at most institutions, right? Is there a sort of association with like, oh, non-traditional and this like weird niche subject matter that we don't know much about, and therefore sort of an unserious class? Not that that's not a reason to do it, obviously. I'm just curious if you think that is a possibility.
I think it's a great question. Generally, my approach has been to beg forgiveness rather than to ask permission, but I'm saying that with the privilege of being a faculty member. I think it's much riskier as an adjunct, and especially if it's important to you that this course continue to be taught. I think it's a very school-specific question. I think at a lot of schools, the administration is not paying attention to what happens day-to-day in class. They may be paying more attention to the course evals, but I think at some places I could see it being risky. I thankfully haven't encountered that.
Yeah, I think Delcy would know better than I do because she interacts with administrations more than I do, because I'm, just the lowly adjunct who tries to keep his head down. And I worry about it too, Conley. Like I like to preach about how, as you've heard me do here today, about how I think, unique approaches really benefit the students. but I don't say the things I'm saying here, frankly, to anyone in a school administration, except someone who I maybe already have identified as being like a familiar ear. So I mentioned going to, some people in the administration of Georgetown earlier this year. Well, there were two particular people that I've already had ongoing conversations with about a postgraduate fellowship in animal law that the school funds. And so, to be able to talk to them and say why I think that position, why I think this course benefits students who may not be dedicated to being animal law practitioners, was a safe space for me to then extol like the great opportunities that exist, in taking our course. But I probably wouldn't talk to a tenured faculty member who's been, regurgitating the same exams in a 1L contracts course for years about the great non-traditional opportunities there exist in this upper level seminar. So yeah, I don't know. I'd like to think that like I can sell anybody on my course, but that's probably not true. So I tend not to say as much about that. I think what that makes me think is like at the two schools that I've taught at, there's vastly different approaches of the administration to how to talk to adjuncts and resources to give them. And I will say that at Georgetown, there's an orientation every year. There are many opportunities where they try to connect adjuncts, even just sort of mix and mingles and those types of things. And we have the experiential courses all fall within a particular sort of program, and there's an opportunity for experiential teachers to talk to each other. And that's great. That feels like a safer space for me to bounce ideas off of and talk about my course, and maybe it gets somebody, in the environmental law faculty or whatever to plug this animal law course because maybe they'll learn about law and policy reform, lawyering in it, even if a student isn't dedicated to animal law, because I've told them we're not preaching that everybody needs to be an animal law lawyer in this course, and we're thinking about what learning they can do, even if they're not going to be animal law lawyers. At Mason, where I also taught for many years, that's not true. You just walk in and walk out of the building after you sign your contract, and there's just it hasn't been to date, at least, sort of support for getting people who are teaching these kind of courses that might use non-traditional means to talk to each other. It's not a good answer.
No, that was super helpful. Thank you.
Well, I see we have about 8 minutes left, so I think it might be nice to move towards talking about implementing some of these tools and these practices. So broadly, could you speak to how a professor who's approaching non-traditional teaching tools for the first time, how they may be able to implement them?
I can start. I think just don't feel like you have to do a whole bunch of things at once. Like just try one thing, maybe a few things in a semester and see how they go. And some of them aren't going to go well, and that's okay. And maybe you have to tweak how you're doing it, or maybe that's just not a good fit for you to do. But I think feeling like you don't have to make massive changes is an important piece of it. And then also just being willing to pivot and being okay with it maybe not going so great. Sometimes it's going to go amazing and other things aren't going to. So awesome.
I love that answer. I don't have much to add other than to say that I have learned from failures in this space. A co-professor of mine who left me to go teach at Vermont Law and then moved on from there. She was the one who came up with the idea of using oral arguments as a potential prep material tool. But we went I think, a little too far at first, and it was weird to the students, and we realized we weren't actually getting across all the things we wanted to get across, but we were able to then realize what great benefits it could have in doses and in particular spots. And that's just, that's not necessarily a non-traditional teaching method, but it's just one tool that allowed us to engage students differently. And, now I use those as some of the prep materials at the at the places and the amount that I like to. So yeah, I agree with Delcy. Just don't try to change everything all at once and see how it goes.
One thing I'll add is for the last few years, I've been keeping an administrative syllabus. You could also do this as a teaching log. And after each class, I try to jot down any thoughts of like things that could be better, things that worked really well, things I want to change. I like to think I'm going to remember it, the following year, but I'm not. I've learned that. So I'm not perfect about doing it, but I do think it's a really, really helpful practice. So then when I'm preparing my syllabus the next year, I look at it. And then before each class, I also look at it.
Thank you. Well, we have about 5 minutes. I do have one more question, but I want to pause here in case anyone would like to ask a question before we move on.
I saw Nikki's question in the chat about rubrics. I'm happy to answer that.
Yes, thank you.
So the question was, if I can get to it.
It says, sorry. Would you like to read it?
Please, thank you.
Are your rubrics for evaluating papers and oral presentations written and distributed to the students? If so, can you please share these?
Yeah, so I'm getting there. So at this point, what I've been doing for my residential classes is telling them the criteria. I don't give them like the points or percentage breakdown. For my online classes, our online program actually requires that. So I do have that for the online class, and I'm happy to share it. I think I want to refine it some more, but I'm definitely happy to share that. And I'm getting there with the other assignments. But I think as long as you tell them what you're looking for, that's the most important guidance that they need.
Okay. Well, then I will finish off our discussion with just one more question. I'm just wondering if you can speak to balancing non-traditional pedagogy with more traditional approaches within the same class, or if you think it's best to keep non-traditional tools exclusive throughout the course.
I love trying to do both. I think I already mentioned a little bit about how I divide the one course into kind of thirds, and 1/3 of it, or one of 3 portions is very traditional. And I like it because I do think, as we said before, students sometimes kind of expect the traditional. So I think that's helpful. But they always end up loving how things are changed up and how learning is different in my course and our course as compared to other courses. That's the comments are always like, this course was different. That's always a positive comment. And so I think it's great to try to incorporate both. As mentioned just now, that mine's very deliberate, in sort of like segments of a course. I'm sure that you could weave them in and out of courses where, on the one hand, maybe you're teaching in a very traditional way, session to session, but you incorporate, field trips or some student-directed learning or whatever asynchronously from the seminar itself. So there are probably a ton of different ways to do this, but I think it's a great idea to try to mix. And the last thing I'll say is I just want to like regurgitate something that Delcy said at the beginning that I think is so great, and that's, whenever I've tried to do something that seems a little non-traditional, it's usually been positively received by the end of the semester, and student engagement in the whole of the class has always gone up. And that's why I'm a big fan of it, because not just preparing students for what it's like to be real lawyers as compared to law students, but just it engages students. It makes students curious about, learning in a way that, just sort of the same old doesn't. So, that's more toward the why than the how for me, but I just wanted to reiterate it.
I definitely agree. Mixing it up, having both in a single class is really valuable because they complement each other really well. And it keeps students on their toes. And I've said this like multiple times, but I do think it's really valuable. And also, I don't know if we're supposed to say this, but the exercise can give you a little bit of a break too. Like it's really good for the students to be like group work there. It gives more students an opportunity to articulate things themselves, and that's really important for learning. And I think it is a good idea to like walk around and be available for them, but it also gives you some change of pace as well.
That just made me think of one more comment, and that's just to say that in all of my courses now I team teach. It means I get paid a lot less, and adjuncts don't get paid anything at all. But I love it because it does give me space to think. And it gives the sort of non-lead professor space to see the students engaging and to kind of direct it. And so I think anything we can do to help students connect with, where with the learning and where we want them to go and is great. And so I never thought of having co-teaching as non-traditional, but I think it is after this webinar. And it definitely gives me the breaks that Delcy talked about that exercises sometimes do to kind of think about where we've been in the session and to engage students in a different way. Good
Well,
for the professors too.
Thank you both so much. I see that we are out of time, but I'd like to thank you both for being our panelists today. And I hope everyone who was on found this webinar as informative as I did. As a reminder, our next webinar will be on October 23rd, where we will discuss online teaching. Our next one after that will be November 20th, again, addressing current politics and issues inside and outside the classroom. So we certainly hope to see you there, and please keep an eye out for more information regarding those webinars. And I hope you all have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.